They told me to mind my manners. I did. They told me to stay quiet, to be grateful, to smile no matter what was said. I did that too. And still, that night, my daughter looked at me as if I were something that had crawled out of the earth to embarrass her. I can still feel the weight of that look more than anything else. It's strange, isn't it? How cruelty doesn't always arrive with shouting or fists. It often arrives as a single, well-placed look across a dinner table that erases the person you used to be. I am 81 years old, and I have learned that humiliation doesn't echo. It lingers like a taste you can't rinse away. The house that night was bright, clean, full of laughter that didn't belong to me. They called it a family dinner, though I think what they meant was a family performance. Everything had to look right for the neighbors: matching plates, expensive wine, candles that smelled of pear and cedar. I remember sitting at the table between my son-in-law and the youngest grandchild, folding the napkin on my lap to keep my hands from shaking. My daughter, Ellen, moved around the table like the mistress of a small kingdom, efficient, decisive, controlling the temperature of the conversation with the same precision she used for her thermostat. She kept calling me mother in that brittle tone that made the word sound like an obligation. The food was fine, the kind that photographs well but tastes of nothing. I remember trying to compliment her cooking. She laughed and said, "It's store-bought, Mother. Don't start dramatizing." The others laughed politely, the way people laugh when they're signaling where the power lies. I smiled, of course. That's what older women do when the air starts to harden around them. We smile to survive the moment, to pretend we're still welcome in rooms that have quietly decided we are not. The first sign of the storm was small. I asked a question, something harmless about her work, about how she managed such long hours without exhausting herself. She froze, glass halfway to her lips, then placed it down and said, "Please don't make this about me tonight." The room tilted slightly, the way it does when everyone senses that a boundary has been crossed, but no one wants to acknowledge it. My son-in-law cleared his throat. The children looked at their plates. I lowered my eyes and whispered, "Of course, dear." That should have ended it. But humiliation is greedy. It rarely stops when it's fed once. I can't recall the exact sequence after that, only that the conversation resumed without me. They discussed holidays, mortgage rates, a new gym. I sat there, nodding occasionally, feeling the distance grow cell by cell between me and the family I had raised. I thought of all the times I'd cooked for Ellen when she was small, the nights I stayed awake with her fever, the mornings I pressed her school clothes with a broken iron. It's dangerous to think of tenderness when you're being erased. It makes the loss unbearable. So I tried not to. I focused instead on the small things, the reflection of the chandelier in the silverware, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the pulse in my wrist that kept reminding me I was still here. When the argument began, it wasn't loud. That's what made it worse. She accused me of undermining her in front of the family. I didn't even understand what she meant. Maybe it wasn't about that evening at all. Maybe it was about the years of invisible debts she carried, imagined debts I never collected. There are families where love is measured like money, where gratitude accrues interest, and the older you get, the more you owe simply for existing. I think ours was like that. After the tension broke, there was silence, long, solid, heavy as stone. I remember wanting to leave, but not knowing where I would go. My daughter's voice changed then. She began to speak in the tone she used with her own children when they disappointed her, low and cutting. She said I had ruined the evening, that I always found a way to turn things sour. And then, the phrase that still drifts through my mind on sleepless nights, You just can't help bringing dirt to everything you touch. It was meant as a metaphor, but it felt literal, as though she were trying to bury me right there at her perfect table. The rest is a blur of movement and shame. I remember standing, my chair scraping the floor, my hands trembling as I tried to gather the strength not to cry. No one stopped me. My grandson glanced up briefly, eyes wide but uncomprehending, before turning back to the glowing light of his phone. My son-in-law poured himself another glass of wine. The house smelled of rosemary and something metallic, maybe my own fear. I went to the bathroom and looked in the mirror. My reflection looked foreign, too small, too old, too careful. I washed my face, adjusted my cardigan, and practiced the expression of someone who would not let herself dissolve completely. When I came back to the table, the conversation had already resumed. They were discussing vacation plans, as though nothing had happened. My chair was gone. Ellen had cleared it away, perhaps to make space for the dessert. There was a clean plate waiting for me at the counter, untouched, empty. I realized then that the dinner had always been about presentation, not celebration. I was no longer part of their story, just an inconvenient preface they didn't know how to delete. Later that night, when I finally reached my small apartment, I sat in the dark without turning on the light. My face burned, not from anything visible, but from the memory of being looked at as if I were beneath them. I thought about calling a friend, but pride is a quiet jailer. It convinces you that solitude is safer than sympathy. I made tea instead, the way my own mother did when she was hurt. 1 sugar, no milk, let it steep until the bitterness feels honest. I sat at the kitchen table and whispered the things I hadn't said out loud at dinner. I told the empty room that I was tired of pretending, tired of being grateful for being tolerated. I told the shadows that I had given them everything, my time, my savings, my love, and that I was done apologizing for existing. It wasn't rage I felt, not really. Rage is clean, fast, almost merciful. What I felt was something slower, denser, like a tide returning to reclaim what had always been mine, my dignity. I realized that the worst part of cruelty is not the act itself, but the way it convinces you that you deserved it. I had spent years believing that if I were kinder, quieter, more accommodating, I would be safe. But you can't negotiate with people who see your kindness as currency. That night, sitting alone with my cooling tea, I understood that love without respect is just a longer form of control. I didn't know yet what I would do. I didn't imagine lawyers or judges or public apologies. I only knew one thing, that this silence I'd been living in wasn't peace. It was paralysis, and if I didn't speak soon, I would disappear altogether. The clock on the wall ticked softly, a small, stubborn heartbeat in the dark. I whispered to it, as if to a witness, "Tomorrow I will be seen." I left the lights off when I went to bed. Darkness, at least, doesn't pretend to love you. It just lets you rest. But before sleep found me, I pictured that dining table again, the candles still burning, the laughter resuming after I'd gone, my absence already rewritten as drama. And beneath that image, another one rose quietly, my mother's face, patient, stern, whispering from somewhere beyond memory. You raised your voice once to teach her how to stand. Now you must raise it again to teach her what it costs to fall. That was the moment, though I didn't yet know it, when my silence ended. The dinner was over, but the reckoning had just begun. I woke to the kind of morning that pretends nothing happened, pale light slipping through the blinds, and the kettle behaving as if last night were a rumor. And for a long minute, I nearly let myself believe that I could fold the memory into a smaller shape and tuck it behind the bread box with the plastic bags I wash and reuse. But then the quiet cut through the room with that particular chill humiliations leave behind, and I understood with a steadiness that surprised me that there is a difference between choosing silence and being pressed into it, and I had spent far too many years confusing the two, so I made tea I barely tasted, put on the navy cardigan that carries my old perfume like a friendly ghost, and dialed the number for legal aid that I had looked up once before and never called, the digits written on the back of a grocery receipt, the ink slightly bled from a spill months ago, and when a woman answered and said her name, softly, professionally, as if offering a chair, I heard my own voice tell the truth without embroidery, that there had been a dinner meant to look like family, that words had been used like instruments, not of music, but of control, that I felt unsafe, not in my body at this exact second, but in my standing, and that the danger for people like me is always the same, the steady thinning of our personhood until we are mostly outline in apology. She did not rush me. She asked for facts, dates, names, and I realized how little I had recorded of my own life beyond the parts that served others. So I opened the drawer where I keep rubber bands and warranties and pulled out the small stack of cards and receipts that tell a truer story than photographs. And as I gave her my daughter's name, Ellen, a strong name I once loved writing on school permission slips, I felt a tremor at the thought that speaking her name in this context made me a stranger to my own history. Yet the woman on the line kept me tethered to the present with practical questions. Did anyone witness the exchange? Were there prior incidents? Had I told anyone immediately after? Could I get to the community center on Maple by noon? They had a clinic day, and an advocate could meet me, and I heard myself say yes, with a clarity that felt like standing up in a moving bus and finding my balance without grabbing the pole. I walked to the center because buses make me seasick, and I wanted the air, even the thin kind you get on streets, lined with cars that never move. And along the way, I rehearsed what I would not say in order to be believed. I would not minimize. I would not say, maybe I misunderstood. I would not cushion my sentences with the muffled cotton of self-blame that daughters find so comfortable to sleep on. And when I arrived, and the advocate, a woman young enough to be my granddaughter, offered me water and a pen, I took both like medicine, and we began the catalog older women dread and require in equal measure, a ledger of small cuts and clever dismissals, of months when my grocery money went to their emergencies, of promises to pay me back, written only as texts with the tone of generosity rather than debt, of times public and private when my competence was laughed at and my memory questioned. And as I spoke, I watched her face remain calm, not because she didn't care, but because she did, and I felt the strange relief of being met by someone for whom my pain was not an inconvenience or a scandal to be hidden from the neighbors. They took photographs, not of injury in the way television trains you to expect, but of the aftermath that systems also recognize. The soiled sweater in a paper bag, the towel I'd used to clean myself still damp in the corner of my laundry basket, the plate I had brought back home because I couldn't bear to leave anything of mine behind in that shining museum of a house, the text my daughter had sent later, short and surgical. Let's not dramatize things, Mother. You upset the children. And the advocate copied my voicemail log, the calls from Ellen's number unanswered by me, not as a game, but as a boundary newly planted. And she asked me whether there was anyone who could attest to a pattern. And I thought of my neighbor, Mrs. Alvarez, who has heard too many of Ellen's raised voice phone calls through these thin walls, And of my pharmacist who watched me pay for vitamins my daughter insisted I take, and then returned 2 days later to buy discount soup because I had run out of cash, and the advocate nodded and said patterns are often more persuasive than a single blaze of cruelty. Fires are dramatic, but embers burn the house down slowly. I told her about the money, not because money is the heart of love, but because it is the language people in buildings with elevators understand. The down payment on Ellen's first car, the college semester I covered when her scholarship fell through, the months after her divorce when I moved in to help with the children and left with less in my account and more in my bones, and how lately there had been new conversations with old shadows about my will, about streamlining things, and ensuring the family home doesn't get complicated. Phrases that sound like care until you hear the arithmetic breathing underneath. And the advocate wrote steadily and then looked up and said the words I didn't know I'd been waiting for. What happened last night was not an isolated scene in a play. It was a culmination. And I felt the strange kindness of that formulation, the way it made a single evening belong to a history that could be understood and therefore changed. By mid-afternoon, a volunteer attorney had joined us, a woman with silver at her temples and hands that folded and unfolded a legal pad with a dancer's economy, and she explained patiently that elder abuse is not always purpled skin and broken things, that it is also coercion and contempt and calculated humiliation, that the law acknowledges power even when it looks like politeness. And she asked me what I wanted not in vengeance, but in remedy, and I surprised myself by saying, before anything else, I want it on paper that I am not imagining this. And she nodded, because documents can drag truth through rooms where feelings get laughed out of the door, and we decided on a protection order tailored to my life, not to keep a dramatic villain away, but to set a perimeter around my days that could not be crossed without consequence, limits on unannounced visits, on financial requests disguised as emergencies, on communications that weaponize duty, and a requirement that any family contact occur in the presence of a mediator until a judge said otherwise. Filing is not a trumpet blast. It is a quiet corridor with fluorescent lights, and that is where the real beginning happened. Me at a counter signing my name with a steadier hand than I'd had in years, the clerk explaining timelines in the voice people use with adults who are paying attention. And as I slid the packet back under the glass, I felt a small, precise click somewhere under my breastbone, a mechanism engaging, the machine of my life shifting from yielding to moving forward. And outside the building, I stood on the steps longer than necessary, not to catch my breath, but to notice that I still had one. And the city seemed slightly altered, not kinder, but more legible, as if the map had been rotated to the right orientation at last. On my way home, I stopped at the drugstore and bought a spiral notebook with a red cover, the kind children take to school when everything is still possible. And I labeled the first page with the date and wrote down everything I could remember from the last year, not for the court alone, but for myself, to reclaim the archive of a life that had been narrated by everyone but me. And I added a list of small witnesses who would never be called but deserved to be noted. The cab driver who watched me wait on the curb with a pie no one would eat. The waitress at the diner who refilled my coffee the morning after and said nothing, but patted my hand in the way women pass courage like salt. And at the bottom of the page, I wrote a sentence that felt like a vow and a diagnosis. I am not dramatic. I am documented. That evening, Ellen called twice, and I did not answer, not because I intended to punish, but because I had moved the conversation from the place where her voice always won to a place where my words would be measured by someone who did not share our blood. And in the second voicemail, she tried honey before the familiar vinegar. She said she loved me, but wished I wouldn't air private family matters. And I sat at the table with the red notebook open and realized how private turns into prison when only one person holds the key. So I let the phone go dark, and I brewed chamomile, and I looked at the notice of hearing the advocate had printed, the date only days away, and I felt the odd mixture of dread and relief that arrives when you know the ground under your feet will not be soft, but it will be solid. I did one more thing before bed, small and monumental. I took from the shoebox under my sink the few photographs I've kept of Ellen as a girl, the gap-toothed smile, the bruised knees from a bicycle fall, the Halloween costume I sewed with aching hands while the rent came due, and I told those pictures, not her, not yet, that I was doing this for the child who believed I could fix anything, that what I would not do is continue to teach the adult that I will tolerate everything, and I slid the photos back into the box, turned off the kitchen light, and felt my home stand a little taller around me, as if it too had been waiting for me to sign my name and say, out loud and on paper, that what happened was real and that I would not live in the version where it wasn't. The days between the filing and the hearing lengthened in the way time does when you've chosen yourself and the world around you begins to negotiate that choice. And the first sign that the ground had tilted came not as thunder, but as paperwork disguised as affection, a pastel card from my daughter left at my door without a knock, the kind with a watercolor meadow and a verse about family being forever. And inside she had written in a tidy, managerial hand that she loved me, that we should have coffee privately, that courts are cold and unnecessary, and if I would simply withdraw the complaint, we could talk like adults about boundaries and expectations. A sentence that sounded so reasonable, I stood in my slippers for a full minute, considering whether I had mistaken courage for pettiness. And then I noticed the second page, tucked behind the first, a pre-printed form for medical power of attorney with a signature line already flagged by a cheerful purple tab. And I felt the temperature of the room drop by several degrees, even though the kettle was whistling, because there it was, the escalation older women know better than they can explain, the sudden concern for your well-being braided to a leash you didn't ask to wear, the invitation to safety that ends at a locked gate. After the card came the chorus, not loud, never loud, a series of calls from numbers I recognized and numbers I didn't, a cousin who has not remembered my birthday in 20 years, leaving a long message about how families should stay out of the system and resolve things in-house, a neighbor who said he had seen a police car on our street, and was everything all right, because you know how rumors get started, a woman from church who couched her curiosity in prayer, and then suggested a mediator she knows who specializes in stubborn elders. And I heard the same music in each voice, a melody of concern in a key that didn't quite match the words. And at night, when the apartment finally exhaled and went quiet, I would sit with the red notebook open and document the soft collisions of pressure and pretense, not because I needed a tally, but because writing made the invisible weight measurable, and measurement, I was learning, is a kind of defense. Ellen did not stop at phone trees. She moved to the modern gospel of group messages, the family thread where photographs of puppies and vacation sunsets share space with grievances dressed as jokes. And one morning before coffee, my screen lit up with a paragraph about how difficult the sandwich generation has it, how caring for an elderly parent is a marathon with no finish line, and how social media is no place for family drama, and then a single sentence with my name anchored in the center, like a thumb on a bruise. Mom's memory has been tricky lately. Please be kind. Followed by hearts and folded hands, and one heroic nephew urging her to hang in there. And because I have spent my life being polite, I nearly thanked them. But I turned the phone face down instead and made oatmeal and reminded myself that I had passed the cognitive screen at the clinic last month, that my bills were current, that the plant in the kitchen was flourishing because I remembered to water it, and that you can be misremembered in public even when you remember everything perfectly. Next came the wellness touch, a phrase so benign I almost invited it in, the knock at my door just after noon from a police officer who had the exhausted kindness of people who do their jobs far beyond the hours they're paid for, and he said there had been a call from a daughter worried about her mother's safety, and could he please come in to see that I was able to care for myself. And I let him, because I wanted witnesses this time, and because my floor was swept, and the soup on the stove was simmering like a small cooperative sun, and we talked about the hearing, and I showed him the packet with the court stamp, and he nodded in that way officers do when they've heard many versions of this story and still believe the person standing in front of them. And when he left, he gave me a card and said to call if anyone's concern felt like a rope, and I put that card in the red notebook with the reverence you reserve for relics of small mercies. The quiet worsening did not live only in rooms. It moved to institutions with the slickness of an eel, and one afternoon my landlord left a message asking, very gently, whether it would be all right to have a brief conversation about the lease and emergency contact policy, because he had received a call from a relative, he would not say which, suggesting that I might be better off, closer to family. And I pictured the phrase on a brochure beside a photo of a sunlit common room, and I called him back and said, my rent has never been late, and my emergency contact is my neighbor Mrs. Alvarez, whose number is printed on the refrigerator in letters large enough for anyone to see. And he said, of course, and that he just needed to make a note. And we both pretended that notes can't turn into narratives if you're careless with the pen. Small sabotages arrived like weather, unsettling the day without knocking anything over. A florist delivering a basket of white lilies that smelled like a waiting room with a card that read, for peace, which is to say, for surrender. An email from a bank I do not use, informing me that someone had attempted to reset my online access. A gentle inquiry from my clinic, wondering if I would like to schedule a comprehensive assessment, because my daughter had expressed concern about functional decline. And I booked the assessment with a calm so deliberate it felt like needlework, because I knew the test would not flatter me, but it would ground me, which is worth infinitely more than being flattered. And when the results came back, I read every line twice and circled the sentences that would anchor the boat when someone tried to tow it away. Oriented to person, place, time, independent in activities of daily living. No evidence of cognitive impairment. Recommend routine follow-up as clinically indicated. Around me, the social air cooled a few degrees. Nothing you could photograph, everything you could feel. The woman who bags my groceries no longer asking about the weather, but instead offering specials on prepared foods with soft eyes. The librarian carefully explaining the large print section, as if I were new to the alphabet. Two acquaintances at church who stopped mid-hymn to ask if I needed a ride home, since you don't drive at night anymore. A sentence that was not true, but might have been if they said it enough times. And at home I practiced the only exercise I had ever disliked, receiving help I did not need without wounding the helper. And when I failed, I forgave myself quickly, because the point was to stay whole, not to win a pageant for graciousness. Ellen's ingenuity is one of the few things I taught her that she has not squandered, so she tried one maneuver I had not expected. She called to apologize in the voice she saved for job interviews, low, warm, textured with concern, and she said that the stress of work and the children and the house had hollowed her out, and she had not been herself at dinner, and she was sorry for the phrases that landed like stones. And before I could reply, she asked if I remembered the color of the scarf she wore to my birthday 3 years ago, a harmless question that slid across the floor toward a trap, and I answered with the color and the cafe and the woman who spilled sugar on our table, because I do remember, and the sigh she gave was not relief, but recalculation, and she pivoted to a memory from my childhood and a recipe I made with my mother, and I answered those too, and at last she said she was worried that strangers at court would not understand us, and that we should talk to a family therapist who could translate mother to daughter and daughter to mother. And I said, as gently as a person can say a sentence that changes the barometric pressure, that strangers might be the only people left who could hear both of us at the same volume. And then I did the thing I never do. I ended the call first. Night was hardest, not because I was afraid, but because the mind is a projector and the walls are generous screens. And so I made rituals out of survivals. I ironed my hearing blouse, though no one but me will know it is ironed. I walked the hallway in slow loops to remind my knees that the ground will be there when called upon. I laid out my documents in a tidy fan on the kitchen table and rehearsed the hands that would unfold each sheet. And when doubt crept in, dressed as humility, are you making too much of this? Will people think you're dramatic? Shouldn't you just be grateful they still invite you? I answered doubt without eloquence or rage. I answered it with the printed sentence that carried the weight of a bench. Elder abuse includes emotional and psychological harm manifested by demeaning, threatening, or controlling behavior, and I would touch those letters with the pad of my finger like a person confirming a pulse. There were days I almost called the whole thing off, days when the sun hit the window just so, and I could pretend we were a different family, and that a conversation over soup would stitch the tear. And on those days, something plain and undeniable would arrive to correct me, a forwarded article about difficult aging parents from Ellen with the note, worth a read, a voicemail from a mutual friend who had heard the gossip and wanted my side, but began by saying, I'm sure it was a misunderstanding, or a memory I had not permitted to surface in years, of the first time Ellen's voice learned the register that undid me, when she was 16 and called me embarrassing in front of her boyfriend because I brought napkins to the park picnic and the wind took them into the lake. And I stood there apologizing to water as if it had taken offense. And the ridiculousness of that apology traveled the decades and stood beside me at the sink until I said out loud, enough. The most dangerous escalation was the one that looked like retreat, the week Ellen stopped calling, when the apartment felt like a stage after the audience has filed out, paper cups under chairs and a script with penciled notes abandoned on the floor, and in the quiet, my body reported the cost with fidelity, sleep that did not restore, breaths that snagged on nothing, a brief, humming panic that arrived while I shelled peas and left while I dusted picture frames. And I learned to talk to the symptoms the way a conductor speaks to a restless section, not with scolding, but with attention. Yes, I hear you, but the oboes are needed here. The melody returns in court. Hold your note. And the body did not exactly obey, but it believed me enough to keep going. And some mornings that is the only victory available, which is still a victory. I understood then why antagonists so often prefer whispers to shouts. Whispers multiply as they travel. They acquire authority in the retelling, and they leave the target looking like a person deranged by gnats, swatting at air. So I kept my hands at my sides and let the gnats announce themselves where the record could catch them. I saved the messages and the invitations that were actually traps. I wrote down dates and names with the detached calm of a weatherwoman. Isolated showers in the afternoon. Expect gusts by nightfall. And when Mrs. Alvarez knocked with a tin of dulce de leche cookies and said in the no-nonsense voice of someone who has survived other storms that she would walk me to the hearing, because company is a kind of armor, I felt my spine lengthen half an inch and thought, yes, this is what escalation does not account for. The quiet army of women who do not need to be asked to stand at your side. On the last evening before the hearing, I laid my outfit across the bed, and it looked like a small flag, navy and white, the colors of a harbor where ships return from difficult weather. And I made a list of the names I would not say in that room, because they are the names of women who kept me intact when the air went thin. My mother, Mrs. Alvarez, the advocate with the steady pen, the clerk who slid my papers under the glass as if handing back a relic. And I wrote one more sentence in the red notebook, not for a judge and not for Ellen, but for the woman whose voice carried me through the hours when the apartment felt like an interrogation room. Tomorrow is not about winning a war. It is about refusing to live in a country where contempt is the law. And I closed the notebook and set it by the door with my bag and the copy of the assessment and the photographs of small evidence that build a larger truth. And I turned off the light knowing that escalation had done its careful work, narrowing the path so thoroughly that forward was the only direction left, which is a kind of mercy disguised as pressure. And I slept not well, not deeply, but sufficiently, which is sometimes the bravest form of rest there is. The morning of the hearing arrived without ceremony, a thin seam of light under the curtains and the sense that everything ordinary, the kettle, the shoes lined up under the chair, the neighbor's radio leaking a weather report through the wall, had made a quiet pact to keep behaving so that I could spend my courage on only one thing. And as I dressed, I noticed my hands, not shaking, but deliberate, buttoning the blouse I had ironed the night before, as if fastening a story that had, until now, refused to hold together. And I thought of my mother's phrase for days like this: take the longest breath you own and spend it slowly. So I did, and the breath felt like a bridge I could walk across without looking down. And when Mrs. Alvarez knocked exactly on time, her handbag swollen with the kind of preparedness I used to carry for everyone else, I let her take my elbow, not because I needed it, but because accepting a small anchor was part of learning the difference between support and control. The courthouse looked the same as every courthouse I have ever been in, which is to say, like a building trying to impersonate fairness, stairs that want you to slow down, metal detectors that ask you to surrender your keys and your impatience. And after the clerk stamped my name in ink that smelled faintly of childhood art projects, we sat on a bench beneath a rattling vent while a parade of human stories in plastic folders moved past us. And I realized with a sort of tender relief that even though my case felt singular in my chest, it was not special to the room. And there was grace in that commonness, because it meant the machinery knew how to handle this shape of hurt, which is sometimes what a person needs, to be processed not with spectacle, but with procedure, to be ushered toward remedy by people whose faces have learned the expressions that won't startle you back into silence. When the bailiff called my case, I stood and felt an old version of myself hover just behind me. The woman who used to lay out her children's clothes at night and whisper into her pillow that tomorrow would be gentler. And I let her place her hands on my shoulders And then I walked forward without borrowing her shame. And the judge, a woman with hair pulled back in a way that said, "Attention is a resource she spends wisely," asked me to state my name for the record, and I heard my voice land in that room with a steadiness I didn't know I had kept. The syllables of my name stitched together by the kind of thread you can only buy after a lifetime of mending. It was not a trial, not a day for closing arguments or righteous speeches. It was a preliminary appearance in a series the clerk had printed on a schedule like bus times, and still something tilted when the judge said, "Ms. Harlow, you may speak briefly to the petition if you wish." Because for the first time in years, someone had offered me speech without telling me what outcome it had to serve. So I spoke not as a mother defending a child's reputation, or as a supplicant asking permission to be disappointed. I spoke as a person who had been placed in a moral corner and was stepping out of it, describing the pattern without embroidery, using words I had written in the red notebook so many times they had lost their tremor. And when I finished, the judge did not congratulate me, which would have been unbearable. She simply said, "Thank you for your clarity." And I felt the file around my story click into a cabinet where it would be found again without being re-explained to people who prefer the smell of doubt. Ellen was there, her lawyer beside her, with the clipped politeness of people who believe in narratives more than facts, and my daughter's face held the look of someone acting in a play she did not audition for, all poise and injury. And when the judge addressed her, she launched into a careful lament about misunderstandings and generational styles and how our family has always had spirited dinners. And she used the phrase, "my aging mother," as if it could lift the weight of what had been said in that house. But the judge, who has likely heard every synonym for excuse, interrupted with a gentleness that carried a spine and said, "This proceeding is about conduct, not categories," and ordered a temporary protection with conditions so precise they felt almost ceremonial. No unannounced visits, no calls after certain hours, no discussion of my health status with third parties, no requests for money that arrive with urgency and end with guilt. And as she read each line, I felt the architecture of my days grow sturdier, not a fortress, but a house with locks that I could turn myself. When we were dismissed, I did not look at Ellen because I had already seen what I needed to see. A person accustomed to managing rooms suddenly encountering one where the furniture would not move for her, and in the hallway, I let the murmur of other lives wash over me like a river that does not know your name and still carries you to the other side. And Mrs. Alvarez squeezed my hand and said, with the delight of someone who has kept bees and knows when a hive is finally thriving, "You sounded like yourself," which may be the most generous sentence a friend can give. Outside the courthouse, the light had shifted into that particular late morning shine that makes windows look like they have decided to forgive the sky. And instead of going straight home, I walked 2 extra blocks to the shoe store, whose display I pass weekly without ever entering, a modest place that smells of leather and effort, and I asked to try on a pair of low-heeled Oxfords with soles that promised both softness and traction. And when the clerk laced them and I stood, I felt the faint shock of being held properly by something designed to carry weight over time. And I bought them with a crispness at the register that surprised the young man into saying, "Good choice." And I said, "I know," and meant something far beyond shoes. Back home, the apartment greeted me with the gentle relief of rooms that have learned not to ask questions, and I placed the court papers in the red notebook as if tucking a child into a safe bed, and then, without planning, I rearranged the furniture by inches, not a dramatic purge, but a calm edit, moving the armchair closer to the window where the afternoon collects itself, setting the table at a diagonal as if to remind myself that angles are allowed, that I do not need to sit square to anyone's expectations. And I opened the kitchen cabinet and discarded the chipped plate that had followed me from 3 apartments ago, because I realized I had been carrying proof of thrift the way other people carry proof of conquest, and I decided I could let the past be the past without hiring it to decorate the present. The kettle whistled, and I made tea and wrote to the advocate to thank her, not with effusion, but with the kind of gratitude that recognizes labor. And then I wrote a short letter to myself, a practice I had once seen in a magazine and dismissed as sentimental, telling the woman who had sat in court that morning what I admired about her restraint, how she did not apologize for existing and did not confuse firmness with cruelty. And I slid the letter into the red notebook because this, too, was evidence worth keeping. The shift, when it came, did not arrive as a trumpet blast or a revelation in stained glass. It arrived in the humble commerce of my day, in the way I spoke to the pharmacist when I picked up my prescriptions, and did not lower my voice when she asked if I had any questions, in the way I answered a call from the bank's fraud department and said with a cheerfulness earned rather than painted on that any changes to my accounts would require my voice and my signature in person, in the way I declined a gathering at church that I knew would be an ambush disguised as a prayer circle, and instead took my neighbor's granddaughter to the library's afternoon story hour, where the reader's voice lifted like a kite over the slight hush of children practicing the art of listening. On my way home, I stopped at a hardware store and bought a small tin of shoe polish, the color of tobacco. And that evening, I polished the new Oxford slowly, working the cloth in patient circles the way my father did on Sunday nights, when Monday still sounded like opportunity. And while I worked, I thought about maintenance, about how I had always poured upkeep into other people's lives while mine frayed at the edges, and how this small, glossy ritual was not vanity, but an oath to return to myself each night and set me back to shining. I started answering the phone differently, not defensively, not with the tightness of a person bracing for the first punch of the conversation, but with the measured friendliness of someone who has decided what will and will not be allowed. And when a relative tried to enlist me in a game of "she said, you said," I said I wouldn't be participating and directed her, with a politeness that left no handholds, to the court order if she had questions about arrangements. And afterward, I did not shake or second guess. I made a sandwich and ate it slowly, tasting the mustard like it was a new spice. That night, before bed, I took the photographs of Ellen as a child from the shoebox again, not to weep into them, but to bless them, to tell each image that I loved the girl in it without agreeing to be harmed by the woman she became. And then I returned them to the box and slept with the window cracked open to let the scent of rain move through the room like a rehearsal for something clean. In the days that followed, I found a place in the world that did not require me to audition, a modest community center class labeled Memoir Circle, but understood by the women who attended as a rehearsal for truth. And I sat at a table with a retired bus driver who wrote in block letters and a former seamstress who wrote like lace, and we read to one another the sentences we were not allowed to say at our own tables, and the facilitator, a young man with a kindness that did not feel like pity, said the only rule was respect and length limits, and I laughed quietly because the second rule was the first boundary I had ever enjoyed keeping. I wrote about my mother's kitchen and the first dress I sewed without a pattern, and the time Ellen lost her mitten and blamed the wind, and as I read my pages, my voice found a timbre that the courtroom had awakened, but the circle warmed, and I realized that while the law could keep my perimeter intact, it was art that would fill the interior with furniture that fit. The midpoint, I suppose, happened on a Tuesday that smelled like wet concrete and oranges, when I stepped off the curb on Maple with the court's paper tucked in my bag and the Oxfords carrying me without complaint, and I caught my reflection in a storefront window, an older woman with her chin lifted not in defiance but in alignment, and I recognized her not as the ghost of my past or the plaintiff of my present, but as the author of what comes next, and I understood with a calm that did not ask for witnesses that my life was no longer a reaction to other people's appetites. It was a practice of my own choosing, and while family might still arrive like weather, I had learned to keep an umbrella by the door and a map in my pocket, and I felt, for the first time in a long time, not merely defended, but oriented, which is a quieter victory, and, I suspect, the kind that lasts. The weeks after the first hearing taught me that institutions can give you a perimeter, but it is people who test the fence for weaknesses, and the second push did not come straight on. It arrived first as a rumor with a clipboard, a social worker on my doorstep, holding the particular smile of professionals trained to look kind while they count the chairs in your kitchen, and she said there had been a community concern about my safety and cognition, and would I mind answering a few questions so she could close the file, and because I had learned that transparency was not a performance, but a survival skill. I welcomed her in and offered tea and requested that she note, in whatever box captured such things, that the kettle was on the stove with a working flame, and that I knew the date and the name of the governor and the dosage of my blood pressure medication without rummaging. Then I showed her the court order with its precise prohibitions and the cognitive assessment from the clinic and the meticulous ledger in my red notebook where the days marched in neat rows. And half an hour later, after she had admired my African violet and written more than she spoke, she folded her papers and said she had all she needed, that she knew this pattern, that she was sorry the pattern had found me, and I walked her to the door with the bittersweet gratitude reserved for strangers who validate you without staying for dinner. The quiet held for 3 days, and then Ellen changed strategies with the brisk efficiency she once applied to science fair projects, not shouting now, not even calling, but filing an emergency petition in probate court for temporary guardianship, the legal equivalent of storming the house with a locksmith instead of a crowbar. And I learned of it from the advocate's email with the subject line "time sensitive," and a tone that did not panic, but did not pretend either. And for one long minute, I put my hand flat on the kitchen table because the room had tilted and I needed a surface to instruct my body in levelness. And then I called the advocate back, and we spoke in the grammar of procedure, rapid but careful. This paper requires this response. This court is not the same as that court. We will appear here at this hour with this documentation. And after I hung up, I laughed once, not with humor, but with recognition, because I remembered the child who used to take apart clocks to see how time worked, and I realized she was still dismantling things. Only now, the object on her table was me. The day of that hearing smelled like old wood and disinfectant, and the judge assigned to probate wore patience like a robe. And when Ellen's lawyer began with a portrait of me as a sweet but confused woman whose sudden legal adventures suggested outside influence, the judge held up a hand and asked for evidence, not adjectives. And I watched with quiet shock as the line between narrative and proof asserted itself in the room like a column. And when our attorney presented the assessment and the social worker's note and my tidy list of appointments, made and kept, and the judge asked me a few questions I answered with the respect that leaves no room for submission, and the petition was denied without ceremony, with a crispness that sounded to my ears like the clean snap of a bad seam being ripped out. And the judge added, almost as an aside, but in a way that would live in the transcript longer than any of us, that guardianship is not a tool for managing family embarrassment. And the clerk looked down to hide a smile that had music in it. Defeat did not mellow Ellen. It focused her, and the next tactic was reputation, because if she could not take my rights, she might yet take my credibility. And so a cousin posted a careful essay on social media about the heartbreak of watching a loved one decline and choose courts over conversation, and friends of friends commented hearts and thunderbolts and cheap theology, and someone tagged the church page, and the church page posted a verse about honoring elders that, if you squinted, sounded like an indictment of me, and the grocery clerk started bagging my produce with a reverence I had not asked for, and at the memoir circle, a new woman arrived and spent 20 minutes not reading about her life, but asking me about mine in a tone that mistook curiosity for care. And I heard the questions for what they were, thin nets cast for details that could be hauled back to Ellen's kitchen and served as proof. And I answered with the artistry of a woman who has folded hundreds of fitted sheets, making clean, firm shapes out of potential mess, telling my story without handing over my privacy. And after she left, the facilitator, whose kindness has a spine, said that our rule about only what you are willing to have repeated should probably be printed larger on the wall. And the bus driver wrote in her block letters that women have always had to build their own echo chambers because the world prefers us in a whisper. Money, the old hinge, creaked next, not as a demand, but as a freeze. My debit card declined at the pharmacy with a soft beep that managed to humiliate without drawing attention. And for 30 seconds, I felt the old heat rise in my chest until the pharmacist, who had become a quiet ally without ceremony, said, "We can run this again." And when the second attempt failed, she pulled me aside and let me use the tiny phone in the consultation room. And a man at the bank, whose practice calm had a few edges, explained that a concerned relative had reported unusual activity and a freeze had been placed until they could verify identity at a branch, which would have been comical if it weren't so effective because the nearest branch had closed last year and the one across town had reduced hours, and I could already hear the family thread preparing a paragraph about how I couldn't manage modern life. So I did what I have learned to do when a system is used as a cudgel. I refused to be rushed. I set an appointment. I took Mrs. Alvarez with me because 2 witnesses are always better than 1. And I arrived with documents that made the manager's smile real by the end of our meeting. Papers clicked, permissions reset, notes added to the file that said, in words I requested he read back to me, that no third party had authority to alter my access. And afterward, Mrs. Alvarez bought us both coffee, and we sat in the corner like women who have survived a small weather event, which we had, though the forecast promised more. The softest attempt came disguised as healing, a request through attorneys for mediation, framed in the language of repair, a chance to speak in a safe room with a trained moderator so we could step outside the machinery and return to the human scale. And the advocate looked at me across her desk and said that sometimes mediation closes wounds and sometimes it reopens them, and she would support me either way. And I thought of my red notebook and my violet and my freshly polished Oxfords and the sentence I had copied from the elder abuse brochure about control-wearing costumes. And I said yes, with conditions that did not tremble. A no-contact shuttle format, separate rooms, statements read rather than traded, an agreement that apologies are not currency and will not buy future access, and the mediator, a woman whose voice had the texture of good twine, nodded and said it would be so, and scheduled an afternoon I dreaded and prepared for, with the same attention to detail I once gave middle school science projects, lists and labels, and a firm sense of what mattered. The day of mediation was hot in the way cities get hot when there is no breeze to carry people's sharpness away, and the office had two identical rooms facing each other across a hallway like a mirrored set in a play about boundaries, and I sat at a table with the mediator and my advocate and the red notebook closed but present, as if to say I did not come empty-handed, and across the hall Ellen and her lawyer sat at a twin table with their own stack of papers, and I imagined a list that cast my memory as errant and my motives as punitive, and the mediator began with rules that felt like prayer: no interrupting, no yelling, the right to pause at any time. And then she invited written statements, and I read mine aloud, not to Ellen, to the room, a map of what had happened and what I required to live without being managed. And when it crossed the hall, I pictured it sitting in front of my daughter like a bowl of plain soup, nourishing but without the spices of blame the family likes to cook with. And the answer came back after a long, thin interval, another map that bent roads and renamed landmarks, and yet in the margins I could see small crossings, places where the mediator's pen had underlined phrases like, "I lost my temper," and "I was unkind." And after hours of shuttle sentences and careful restatements, we ended not with a hug or a photo or a promise, but with an agreement as modest and revolutionary as a properly hung door, scheduled contact in public spaces with a third person present, no requests for money framed as emergencies, no public statements about my health, and a handwritten addendum that any future disagreements would be addressed through counsel rather than in kitchens where cutlery and old narratives lived too close together. If the second escalation had ended there, it would have been almost merciful. But families, like weather, build in layers, and 2 days later, a journalist called with a courteous voice and a hunger I recognized from a lifetime of watching people plate other people's lives, saying there was a story circulating at the intersection of aging and family courts, and would I like to comment before publication? And for a beat, my throat closed, because the thought of our private sorrow in public felt like being asked to undress under a fluorescent light. And then I remembered the protection orders clause about public statements and the simple truth that silence can be misquoted. And I said I would not discuss details of a legal matter, but that I hoped any article would include resources, because many elders do not know they can ask the law for a chair at their own table. And when the piece appeared, it was mostly careful, but not entirely. And the photograph they used of me was an old one from a charity event where my smile looked like a person practicing optimism, and the caption called me estranged, which is a word that lands like frost. And I went to the memoir circle and read instead of hiding, and the women around the table did what women have always done in the face of labels. They offered me their first names and their stories and their plain bread, and I left with a scarf someone had knit and an invitation to a volunteer shift at the community pantry where hands matter more than reputations. The heaviest pressure came from within, not as weakness, but as an old loyalty, saluting one last time before demobilizing, the part of me that had built a cathedral around Ellen's better days, wanting to kneel again and polish the brass of her excuses. And I managed it the way you manage a tide, not with walls, but with calendars and errands, giving myself tasks that fit the size of the hour, repotting the violet, polishing the Oxfords, writing down in the red notebook the small harms that still arrived, the bank postcard reminding me of beneficiary options, the anonymous letter urging me to make amends while I still had time, the church acquaintance who said sorrowfully that funerals are awkward when families fracture, and right after each one, in the next line, I wrote a counterweight, the shoe store clerk who asked about my day and actually waited for the answer, the boy at the library who offered me his seat without making me feel negotiated, the social worker's phrase, "close the file," which I repeated like a blessing when the phone lit up after midnight with numbers I didn't recognize. Somewhere in that restless weather, I understood that escalation is often a test of the new muscles, the world pressing to see if this posture is performance or practice, and I answered not with speeches, but with repetition, waking, dressing, eating, reading, showing up at the pantry, with my sleeves rolled and my hair pinned, letting usefulness return me to a scale at which the noise could not drown the signal. Then Ellen chose the one tactic I had not prepared for because I had filed it, against all evidence, under never. She sent the children, not literally, not as couriers of apology, but as a photograph from a school event with a note that said it would be nice if Grandma could come next time, which on its face was simple and true, and on its underside was a wedge designed to split me between the law and longing. And I sat with that picture for a long hour, remembering the way small hands cling and the particular light of gymnasium bulbs, and I decided with a clarity that made me place the photograph face down, that love for children is not a pass for adults, and if I wanted to show up for them in any meaningful way, I had to finish the work of establishing a world where my presence was not a prop. And I wrote back through counsel that I would attend any event where our agreement was observed, and that I would bring a book for each child afterward. And the answer that came was silence, which is its own temperature, and I let it be. And the next day I bought 2 paperbacks with spines I knew would survive backpacks, and made a note in the red notebook titled "For Later." And I underlined it twice, because hope without agenda is a fragile, necessary thing. The second escalation reached its crest the week the pantry scheduled me for a Saturday morning distribution, and Ellen's lawyer scheduled a status conference for the same hour, a coincidence I did not believe in, and I called the court and the coordinator at the pantry and rearranged without apologizing, a small triumph that would have been unthinkable a year ago when my calendar was a sieve that caught everyone's needs but mine, and when I stood behind the folding table handing out rice and cans of tomatoes and peanut butter to strangers whose eyes met mine without agenda. I felt the steadiness that no ruling can grant and no rumor can steal. And that afternoon, back at my kitchen table with my notebook and my cup of tea, and my violet blooming the kind of purple that refuses to be ignored, I understood that the storm had done its last hard raining for a while. The clouds thinned, the air cooled, the phone quieted, not because Ellen had found a better story, but because I had, and the next chapter would be written in a room with a bench and a seal and a woman in a robe who would ask us both to speak without props. And for the first time, I did not dread that room. I welcomed it, not because I wanted spectacle, but because I wanted the sort of ordinary justice that asks only this: tell the truth and then live by it. The last hearing did not look like a finale, so much as a stubborn Tuesday that had dressed itself in dark wood and fluorescent light. Yet from the moment I crossed the threshold, I knew the room would keep what was said inside it. and that simple promise steadied me more than the water fountain or the bench where Mrs. Alvarez sat with her handbag and her faithful attention, because by now I understood that closure is less a ceremony than a room in which the truth is permitted to occupy every chair. My advocate arranged our papers with a calm that had grown familiar. The red notebook lay square upon the table like a small, well-built brick. And when the clerk called our case, I rose and felt the floor under my shoes answer back without complaint, a kind of conversation with the ground I had not known I was missing until the Oxfords taught it to me. The judge was the same woman from the first hearing, her hair tucked back and her questions tucked sharper still, and after we stated our names, she began not with speeches, but with a careful stitching of dates, filings, phone records, and the earlier order, drawing a line that ran through months of noise and brought us to this particular morning with the authority of a map rather than a myth. Ellen was already there, poised beside her lawyer in a dress that wanted to be remembered, and when she looked at me, I saw the calculation of a person measuring angles, testing which version of the story might find purchase in this climate-controlled air. But it is the nature of rooms like this to make certain forecasts obsolete, and when the judge asked if there had been compliance with the temporary protections, the answer on our side was a ledger, and on theirs a hesitation, and that small silence turned brighter in the transcript than any accusation I could have offered. My advocate asked me to speak, not to perform, but to place the last stones in a wall that had been laid with patience, and I did not begin with adjectives or family history. I began with the sentence that had been practicing in my throat for weeks, that safety for older people is not a favor our families grant us when it is convenient, but a right the law recognizes even when intimacy has become a method of control. Then I read from the notebook the entries that showed how escalation had learned new costumes, the bank freeze, and the wellness visit, and the cousin's public lament. And I held up the evaluation page that used the sober vocabulary of orientation and function and capacity to return me to myself in the eyes of those who require testing before belief. And I described without embroidery the way private corrections had failed and how procedure, unromantic and indispensable, had kept the air breathable. Ellen's lawyer answered with the well-shaped concern of someone who has practiced sounding like care, and there were lines about generational misunderstandings and about daughters stretched thin by work and children, and about the heartbreak of being portrayed as an enemy by a parent one still loves. And for a moment, I saw the faces of strangers in the gallery soften, as they always do, for the idea of love. But the judge lifted her pen and asked, again, for evidence, and in that request lay the difference between a family kitchen and a courtroom, because kitchens are built to feed stories, while courtrooms are built to weigh them, and after a few documents that did not carry the weight advertised, the judge turned to Ellen directly and asked in a tone without malice whether the words attributed to her at the dinner had been said, and Ellen hesitated as if considering whether the lie would stand up in this particular weather, and then she spoke the phrase aloud, not to me, but into the room, and the words sounded smaller than they had in the house where they were born, and that smallness was its own kind of indictment. What happened next was not theatrical, it was precise. The judge spoke about patterns and about the law's obligation to read not just the headline of a harm, but the paragraphs that made it inevitable. And she explained that protection orders are not punishments, but scaffolds around a person's safety, and that violations and workarounds, financial, social, or reputational, count as attempts to pull the scaffold down. She denied again the guardianship that had been dressed as mercy. She extended the protection to a longer term than I had allowed myself to hope for. She restricted public commentary about my health and finances to the narrow lane of need to know. She ordered any contact to be scheduled and mediated. She added a clause I had not thought to request that barred third-party proxies from doing what the order forbade. And then, with a careful attention I will not soon forget, she addressed restitution, not of money I could not quantify, but of dignity that required a different currency. The court cannot force love, she said, but it can require understanding, and she ordered Ellen to complete a course on elder abuse and coercive control, not as a box to tick, but as a curriculum with a certificate to be filed with the clerk, and she assigned community service hours at a senior center where the work is humble and the faces are unignorable. And for once, the phrase "give back" meant something more than a press release. There remained, however, the question of acknowledgement, because orders can guard the perimeter, but only truth can unlock the door you keep barricaded with shame. And perhaps the judge knew that, or perhaps she is simply thorough, because she asked Ellen to read into the record a simple statement drafted with the mediator's help, one that did not pluck the strings of pity or lean on the crutch of stress, a statement that named what was done and to whom, and required the sentence, "I am responsible for my words and their harm," to be articulated clearly enough that the court reporter could capture every syllable. In the soft shuffle that followed, my eyes did not go to Ellen's face. They went to the hands I have known since they were small and sticky with orange slices, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt my own hands relax, because accountability was being asked of the adult, not the memory of a child I kept rescuing long after she learned to swim. When the reading was finished, the judge looked at me, not with triumph, not with pity, and asked if there was anything I wished the order to include that had been missed, and I said in the measured voice I had earned that the court had covered the things I feared and the things I had not known to fear, and that the rest would be my work, to live within this safety as someone who no longer bargains with her own worth. There was a moment, brief but real, when the judge paused as if weighing whether a symbolic gesture would illuminate the law without turning justice into theater, and she asked if I had brought the worn object I had mentioned in my statement, the scuffed shoes that had carried me through these months like small boats, and I nodded and placed them on the table, not as trophies, but as witnesses, and she invited Ellen, not commanded, invited, to take a clean cloth the clerk produced, and, before this room that now contained our ugliest sentence and our best attempt at repair, to remove a mark from the leather while saying the words she had just read into the record, not because shoes matter, but because work done with one's hands can teach what the mouth alone cannot. And after a long breath, Ellen did as asked, awkwardly, carefully, softly, and it was not humiliating, and it was not absolution. It was a human being performing a small act of maintenance in a place built for maintenance of a larger kind, and the gesture did not fix a life, but it marked a turn, and that was enough for me, because I had come here for turns, not miracles. When the gavel's soft tap released us back into the corridor's draft, and the smell of disinfectant and coffee, I did not feel victorious. I felt aligned, and alignment is its own quiet power. Mrs. Alvarez hugged me with the brisk affection of a woman who knows the difference between celebration and relief, and my advocate squeezed my shoulder and said we would file the paperwork this afternoon and then begin the work of not thinking about court for a while, which sounded like a luxury and a discipline both. In the elevator, a young clerk glanced at my shoes and said his grandmother swore by that brand, and I told him she was right, and that good shoes, like good orders, make the ground honest, and he laughed as if he knew exactly what I meant. Outside, the air had that particular brightness that cities get after rain has washed the dust off the trees without anyone noticing, and I stood for a minute on the courthouse steps, not to savor a scene, but to make sure my legs understood that they were free to choose any direction. Back home, I placed the certified copy of the order in the red notebook, and then, because paper deserves company, I wrote a letter to myself that began with the words, "You kept your promise," and I boiled eggs and arranged them on a plate with salt and a sliced tomato, and ate them slowly at the table I had set at a diagonal. And when the phone rang with a number I did not recognize, I let it go to voicemail and found that I did not need to hear it, whatever it was, to continue chewing. Later, I walked to the senior center where Ellen would complete her hours and asked if they needed volunteers who can stack books or fold laundry or read the headlines out loud to people who like the sound of a day being named. And the director, a woman with the posture of someone who has carried too many trays and refuses to stoop for anyone, said they always need hands, and I wrote my name on a list because the order had given me a perimeter, but service would give me a center, and I wanted my life to have both. That night, the Oxford sat by the door with their small, honest shine, and I thought about all the things the judge could not order: love, remorse, history rewritten, and I found that I did not miss them in the way I used to, because what had been returned to me was not a daughter or a past. It was my authority over my own days, the right to set a table that did not seat contempt, the ability to walk into rooms without shrinking to fit someone else's comfort. I opened the window and let the evening air move across the sill, and I whispered into it what my mother would have said if she had been here to stand with me on marble floors and watch a life turn by increments. That respect is a practice, not a favor, and that justice, when it is most itself, sounds less like thunder than like a lock turning without resistance. I slept with the quiet fatigue of a person who has finished a long errand on foot and arrived exactly where she intended, not triumphant, not broken, simply present. And in the dark, the room breathed with me, as if relieved to keep only ordinary secrets again. The months that followed the ruling unfolded like fabric, finally allowed to relax after years on a tight loom. And I learned again what ordinary life feels like when it is not lived under inspection. The mornings belong to me now, the soft whistle of the kettle, the rhythm of my shoes on the hallway as I walk to fetch the mail, the low hum of the radio speaking to no one in particular. The courthouse receded to the size of a landmark in memory, important but not looming, and the red notebook, thick with its layers of entries and signatures, moved from the kitchen table to the drawer where I keep mementos that no longer ache. I visited it sometimes, not to reread, but to touch the cover and remind myself that survival can be documented, that bureaucracy, for all its gray smell and dull furniture, had offered me a vocabulary for protection when love had refused to provide one. Ellen kept her distance, which was both strange and restful. Her community service began and ended without fanfare, and I heard, through the town's murmuring grapevine, that she worked dutifully and quietly, folding laundry, distributing trays, learning how to look directly into the eyes of the old without flinching. I did not attend, though the invitation to visit the center always stood open. Instead, I volunteered on a different day, preferring the comfort of strangers who knew me only as a steady pair of hands. There was peace in that mutual anonymity, a kind of rebirth through usefulness. I folded towels beside a man who spoke little but smiled often, and in the cafeteria I read aloud the headlines to those whose eyes had given up the fight, and in the pauses between articles I found a rhythm closer to prayer than to speech. It astonished me that life, once broken down to the basic actions of care, could rebuild its dignity so efficiently. No declarations, no apologies, just warm water, fabric, and the hum of people being tended to. Sometimes the volunteers whispered about the woman in the other shift who looked familiar, who worked with a precision that suggested penance. And once, when our schedules accidentally overlapped, I saw Ellen at the far end of the corridor carrying a basket of linens. She was thinner, her hair tied back in a simple knot, and she did not see me. I stood still, half in shadow, watching her move with a focus I recognized from her childhood when she learned to tie her shoelaces, deliberate, cautious, proud. I felt neither victory nor vengeance, only a weary tenderness for the idea of her, the child I had, the woman I survived, the echo that still lived in my gestures. I left without speaking, and the air outside the building tasted clean in a way I had not expected. It struck me then that forgiveness is not a moment, but an erosion, a slow reshaping by time, until the sharp edges of pain turn into a shoreline where one can finally stand. At home, I rearranged the living room again, not because it needed it, but because change, however minor, keeps the spirit supple. I bought a plant with leaves that reach for light like slow applause, and I let it choose its place near the window. The violet, old and loyal, bloomed twice that spring, as if rewarding my persistence. My neighbors noticed the flowers when they came for tea, and Mrs. Alvarez, who still carried her quiet humor like a sword, said I looked younger. I told her that peace is an excellent moisturizer. She laughed until she coughed, and the sound filled the apartment with something better than youth. It filled it with presence. The phone rings less now, and when it does, I no longer brace for impact. A few weeks ago, an unfamiliar number appeared, and after a long hesitation, I answered. It was my granddaughter, the older one, the one who had been a silent observer through all the commotion. Her voice trembled at first, but steadied as she spoke. She said she had found an essay I had written in the Memoir Circle's newsletter about invisible women and visible courage, and she wanted to tell me that she understood. Mom says you made things hard, she added, her honesty unfiltered by diplomacy. But I think you made things clear. The line crackled, and I heard the faint clatter of a school hallway behind her, the sound of a world continuing. We agreed to meet for coffee after her exams. She called me Grandma, in the old way, soft and unhurried. When the call ended, I sat for a long time in the stillness, holding the phone as if it were a fragile bridge between two generations who might yet learn to meet in the middle without burning it down. I write less these days, but when I do, the sentences come slower and truer. The red notebook is full, so I've begun a blue one, its cover still uncreased, its pages smelling faintly of ink and future. I no longer record every slight or tremor. Instead, I write what grows, a new recipe, a volunteer shift, the way morning light lands on the silver frame that once held Ellen's school photo and now holds an image of the sea. Memory, I've learned, is not proof, it's soil. You can grow bitterness or wisdom in it, depending on what you water. I've decided to plant silence, the nourishing kind that lets other things root. Sometimes I pass the courthouse on my walks, not to relive anything, but to remind myself that structures built for justice can also be monuments to endurance. The marble glints in the afternoon. indifferent to who won or lost, and that indifference comforts me. It means the story has been absorbed into something larger than either of us. I stand there a minute, then move on, feeling the weight of the day settle in a manageable way, the way good shoes absorb stones on the path without complaint. Evenings are my favorite now. I sit by the window with a cup of mint tea and listen to the world settling into its smaller sounds. A car door, a dog's bark, a neighbor's laughter leaking through the walls. I think of the women I've met at the center, the ones still finding their voices, and sometimes I write them letters I never send. They all begin with the same sentence: do not wait for permission to exist. I wish someone had written that to me decades ago, but perhaps the point of surviving is to become the person who writes it for others. The clock ticks softly, not a countdown anymore, but a companion. When I turn off the light, I whisper a simple benediction to the room. Let tomorrow be ordinary. Let it arrive without drama. Let it find me ready. And in that quiet, I realize that peace does not sound like absence. It sounds like breath returning to its own rhythm. The world, in its careless way, has not changed much, but I have, and that is enough. I have learned to live in the calm aftermath of storms, to walk through the rooms of my life without fear of what waits behind the next door. I am not a victim and not a heroine. I am an old woman who told the truth, and that, finally, is all the title I will ever need.